I remember the sound. That's what haunts me most in these final moments, as I feel my own lungs labor against the failing rebreather, as I watch the last flickers of the cogitator banks die around me. Not the screams, there were so many screams, not the artillery that shook dust from the ceiling of our bunker for 3 straight weeks, not even the wet tearing sounds when the xenoforms breached the eastern wall. No, what I remember, what plays in an endless loop behind my eyes as I bleed out onto the cold ceramite floor, is the sound of an Astartes taking a breath. You have to understand something about the angels. That's what we called them, though their chapter designation was something else, something I was never cleared to know fully. 7-foot giants in armor the color of old bone, with dark crimson trim that reminded me of the clotted blood that collected in the drainage channels after processing shifts. They came to our world 3 months into the siege, when it became clear that the PDF forces couldn't hold against the tide that boiled up from the world's crust, when even the orbital bombardments did nothing but crack open new fissures that vomited forth more of the things. I was nothing. A servitor technician, 3rd class, assigned to maintain the ammunition hoists in sub-level Gamma of Firebase Secundus. My name was on a register somewhere in the Administratum archives, one line among millions, with my birth date, my work designation, my daily caloric allotment, and eventually soon now my date of cessation. I had never expected to see an Astartes. People like me, we existed in the cracks of the Imperium, the spaces between the grand narratives of heroes and martyrs. We loaded shells, we cleared jams, we died when equipment failed, or when the enemy broke through, or when we became more expensive to maintain than to replace. But I saw them, I heard them, and that sound, that simple, human sound in the midst of inhumanity, it broke something in me that hasn't healed. The first time was in the ammunition bay. I was performing routine maintenance on Hoist 7, my hands black with grease, my rebreather fogged with my own breath. The hoists were temperamental things, machine spirits that required constant appeasement and maintenance, prone to jamming when the temperature fluctuated or when the humidity from the recyclers got too high. I was alone. My shift partner had died 2 days prior, crushed when Hoist 3's cable snapped, and they hadn't assigned a replacement yet. They wouldn't. The siege had gone on too long. We were all replacements now. Temporary measures until the inevitable. The alarm klaxons were screaming their usual rhythm, 3 short bursts followed by 2 long, the pattern that meant contact on the eastern perimeter. I'd learned to work through the noise, to let it become background static, another sensation to be filtered out, along with the ache in my back and the hunger that never quite went away despite the nutrient paste they distributed every 8 hours. I was deep in Hoist 7's gear assembly when I felt it, a change in the air pressure, a displacement that made my ears pop. I turned, wrench still in hand, and there he was. The angel stood in the doorway of the ammunition bay, too tall for the frame, his head nearly brushing the reinforced lintel. The armor was battle-scarred, scorched black in places, one pauldron bearing a long gouge that had exposed the ceramite beneath the paint. But what struck me, what stopped my heart for several beats, was how still he was. Guardsmen move with nervous energy even when standing at attention. PDF troopers fidget, shift weight, scratch at their flak armor. Servitors, of course, don't move at all unless commanded. But the angel was different. He possessed a stillness that was somehow more alive than movement. A coiled potential that suggested he could explode into violence at any moment, while simultaneously being at perfect rest. He was looking at the hoists, his helmet tilted slightly, and I realized with a cold shock that he was assessing them. Calculating load capacities, ammunition types, firing rates. In the seconds it had taken me to register his presence, he had probably catalogued every detail of the bay, identified every weakness, planned 3 different ways to fortify the position, or failing that, to destroy it utterly. I wanted to speak, to acknowledge him, to ask what he needed, but my voice had fled, leaving me standing there with my wrench and my grease-stained hands, a speck of mortal insignificance before a post-human demigod. And then he breathed. It wasn't loud. The armor's rebreather system produced a soft hiss, mechanical and regulated, but underneath it I heard something else, something organic, the actual expansion of lungs, the intake of air, the functioning of a biological system beneath all that ceramite and adamantium. It was so human, so normal, so utterly at odds with everything else about him, that my mind stuttered trying to process it. The angel turned his head toward me then, and though I couldn't see his eyes through the red lenses of his helmet, I felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing pressing against my chest. He said nothing. After a moment, 5 seconds, an hour, he turned and left, his massive boots silent despite their weight, moving with a grace that should have been impossible for something so large. I stood there shaking for a long time after he'd gone. The wrench fell from my fingers and clattered against the deck plating, the sound sharp and real and ordinary. I sank down against Hoist 7's support stanchion and tried to understand what had just happened, why that single breath had affected me so profoundly. It was because I'd forgotten, I think. Forgotten that they were human once. The propaganda reels showed them as they are now perfect weapons, living instruments of the Emperor's will, angels of death who know no fear. But before the transformation, before the implants and the hypno-conditioning and the surgical remaking, they had been boys, children selected and taken and rebuilt into something greater and more terrible. And somewhere inside that armor, beneath the extra organs and the enhanced musculature and the psychological conditioning that could turn a human being into a living weapon, there was still a creature that needed to breathe. The thought terrified me more than the xenoforms did. At least the enemy was other, alien, something I could categorize as separate from myself. But the angels were human, or had been, or were something hovering in the space between human and something else entirely. They were what the Imperium could make of us, if it chose. They were the logical endpoint of the doctrine that individual lives meant nothing compared to the survival of humanity as a whole. They were proof that you could take a person and remake them so thoroughly that almost nothing of the original remained, and they would not only accept it but embrace it as the highest honor. I went back to work. What else was there to do? The hoist still needed maintenance. The shells still needed to move from storage to the gun positions. The siege still ground on, day after day, week after week, turning our world into a meat grinder that processed human bodies into corpses with industrial efficiency. My hands moved through the familiar patterns of maintenance: check the tension, oil the gears, test the lift capacity, recite the catechism of function to appease the machine spirit, while my mind circled endlessly around that single sound. The overseer came through 3 hours later, a squat man whose name I'd never learned, his face permanently set in an expression of irritated disappointment. He carried a data slate and made check marks as he walked the line of hoists, grunting occasionally when something met his standards or making sharp notes when it didn't. When he reached my position, he stopped, squinted at hoist 7, then at me. "You're behind schedule," he said. His voice came out flat through the Vox grill of his rebreather, robbed of inflection. "Yes, overseer," I replied. There was no point in explaining. The angels didn't exist in reports. You didn't note their presence on timesheets. They were like weather, something that happened and affected your work, but wasn't itself accountable or explainable within the mundane systems of labor management. He made another mark on his slate. "Double shifts until you're caught up. Report to the reclamation detail when you're done here." My stomach clenched. Reclamation was the term they used for recovering ammunition from the bodies of the dead, both ours and theirs, when possible. It meant going into the aftermath, into the places where the fighting had been worst, and pulling shells from the cooling corpses of gun crews or digging them out of the wreckage of destroyed positions. It was necessary work. We were always short on ammunition, but it was the kind of necessary that left you changed, that accumulated in your mind like toxic residue. "Yes, overseer," I said again. He left. I finished with hoist 7 and moved to hoist 8. My movements automatic now, my mind elsewhere. The ammunition bay was deep in the firebase's core, surrounded by meters of reinforced rockcrete. But even here, I could feel the vibration of the guns, the constant shuddering rhythm that never stopped. We fired shells the size of my torso at targets I never saw, would never see, engaging an enemy that existed for me only as abstract numbers on casualty reports, and as the screams that sometimes filtered down from the upper levels when the perimeter was breached. I thought about the angels again. There were 12 of them now, or that's what the rumors said. 12 against thousands, maybe tens of thousands of the xenoforms. The numbers should have been laughable, should have been a death sentence. But the angels didn't die like we did. They moved through the enemy like reapers through wheat, their bolt guns speaking with voices like thunder, each round a small explosion that could tear a human-sized target into fragments. I'd seen the aftermath once, called up to help clear a jam in one of the outer defensive emplacements. The xenoforms were scattered across the killing ground in pieces, the ground slick with their ichor, and in the midst of it, a single angel, reloading with movements so practiced they seemed choreographed, his armor splattered with alien blood that steamed in the cold air. He hadn't breathed then. Or if he had, I hadn't been close enough to hear it. He'd just moved to the next firing position, weapon ready, settling in with the patience of stone while the next wave formed in the darkness beyond the floodlights. The shift change came eventually. I reported to the reclamation detail as ordered, joining a crew of 20 other servitor technicians and menials in the staging area of sub-level Delta. We were issued rebreathers with fresh filters, hazard suits that sealed at the wrists and ankles, and shock prods for dealing with any xenoforms that might not be completely dead. The detail leader was a woman whose face was a map of burn scars, her left eye replaced with a crude augmetic that whirred when it focused. "Eastern approach, sections 12 through 18, she said, her voice clipped and professional. "Intelligence says the area was cleared 4 hours ago. Primary objective is ammunition recovery, secondary is salvageable equipment, tertiary is dog tags and personal effects for the administratum records. Stay together, stay alert, stay alive. Emperor protects." "Emperor protects," we echoed, the response automatic and meaningless. They opened the blast doors, and we filed out into the aftermath. The smell hit first, even through the rebreathers. Something acrid and chemical, mixed with the copper tang of human blood and something else, something alien that made my sinuses burn. The eastern approach had been a wide corridor, 30 meters across, and reinforced with buttresses every 20 meters. Now it was a abattoir. The walls were scorched black, pocked with impact craters from bolter rounds and las fire. Bodies lay in heaps, most of them in pieces, human and alien mixed together in a tangle that made it hard to tell where one ended and another began. The lights were out, so we worked by the illumination of our helmet lamps, 20 beams of light cutting through the darkness and smoke. I moved to the nearest pile and began the process, trying to breathe shallowly, trying not to think about what I was doing. This had been a gun crew, probably manning one of the heavy stubbers that had been positioned along the corridor. 3 bodies, or what remained of them. I found ammunition belts wrapped around torsos, magazines in belt pouches, loose rounds scattered across the floor. Everything went into the collection bags. I was reaching for a magazine when I heard it again. That sound. I froze, my hand extended, my heart suddenly pounding so hard I could hear it over the vox chatter of the reclamation crew. The breath had come from deeper in the corridor, from the darkness beyond where our lights reached. It was the same sound, that soft mechanical hiss overlaying something organic, something living. One of the angels was still here. I should have kept working, should have focused on the task, collected the ammunition, moved to the next position. But instead I stood, slowly, and turned my light toward the source of the sound. The beam swept across more bodies, more destruction, and then caught the edge of something pale, something massive. He was sitting against the wall about 40 meters down the corridor, in what had probably been a defensive hardpoint before the fighting. His armor was more damaged than the first angel's had been, the right pauldron completely missing, the breastplate cracked and exposing the black carapace beneath. His helmet was off, resting on the ground beside him, and I could see his face. That was the second shock, the second moment of dissonance that my mind struggled to process. The first, Angel had been hidden behind his helmet, allowed to remain inhuman and distant, but this one's face was visible, and it was wrong in ways I couldn't fully articulate. Too perfect and too brutal at the same time. Skin like pale stone, eyes too far apart, features that seemed sculpted rather than grown. He looked young, impossibly young for someone who had probably seen centuries of war, but also ancient, as if youth and age had merged into something outside normal time. He was wounded. That shouldn't have been possible. The angels didn't get wounded, didn't bleed, didn't fail, but I could see the damage now that I was looking. A ragged tear in his side where the armor had been breached, blood seeping slowly through despite the coagulants and healing factors his body undoubtedly possessed. His breathing was labored, each inhale a conscious effort, and I realized with dawning horror that he was dying. An angel, dying. The universe tilted. Everything I'd been taught, every piece of propaganda I'd absorbed, every comforting lie about the invincibility of the Emperor's finest, all of it crumbled in an instant. If they could die, if even they could be broken, then what hope did the rest of us have? What hope had we ever had? I must have made a sound, or perhaps he simply noticed my light because his eyes focused on me. They were amber, or maybe gold, catching the illumination and throwing it back with an intensity that seemed to pin me in place. For a long moment we stared at each other across the carnage-strewn corridor, and I saw something in his expression that I hadn't expected, that I hadn't thought the angels capable of. Recognition, not of me specifically, but of what I represented. Another human being, another servant of the Imperium, another small and fragile thing trying to survive in a galaxy that specialized in extinguishing small and fragile things. Then he closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the wall, and I understood that he was waiting for death, or for his enhanced physiology to repair the damage, or for orders from someone who would tell him to stand and fight despite his injuries, waiting with the same patience he'd shown at the firing position, the same inhuman stillness that somehow contained infinite potential for violence. Someone from the reclamation crew called my name. I turned away, breaking the moment, and went back to collecting ammunition from the dead, but I couldn't shake the image of him sitting there, couldn't unhear the sound of his breathing, ragged and pained and so terribly human despite everything else about him. We worked for 6 hours in that corridor, filling bag after bag with recovered ammunition and equipment. The angel never moved. Several times I glanced in his direction, my helmet lamp picking out the pale shape against the wall, and each time he was exactly as I'd left him, eyes closed, breathing slow and measured, waiting. None of the others seemed to notice him, or if they did, they knew better than to remark on it. You didn't discuss the angels. You didn't question their presence or their actions. They existed in a space above normal military hierarchy, answerable only to their chapter command and ultimately to the Emperor himself. When we finally returned to sub-level Delta with our loads, I was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. The detail leader checked our bags, made notes on her data slate, dismissed us to our rest cycles. I should have gone to my assigned bunk, should have tried to sleep during the 6 hours allotted before my next shift. Instead, I found myself back in the ammunition bay, standing in the exact spot where I'd first heard that sound, trying to understand what it meant. The hoists were quiet now, their machine spirits at rest during the lull in firing. Somewhere above me, the guns had paused, probably being serviced or reloaded or simply given time to cool before the next engagement. The silence was oppressive after so many weeks of constant noise, a void that demanded to be filled. I thought about the boy he'd been, the angel in the corridor, before the transformation, before the Imperium had taken him and rebuilt him into a weapon. What had his name been? Had he had a family? Parents who wept when he was selected or felt honored that their son would serve? Had he been afraid when they began the process, when they started cutting him open and putting in the extra organs, when they conditioned his mind to accept violence as sacrament? Or had he welcomed it? Had he gone gladly into that transformation, seeing it as the highest calling, the greatest honor? The propaganda said they all did, that selection for the Astartes was a blessing beyond measure. But propaganda was designed to smooth over uncomfortable truths, to make the unacceptable seem noble and necessary. I realized I was shaking. Cold or shock or something else. The realization that I'd been thinking heretical thoughts, questioning not just the actions of the Imperium but its fundamental nature. Such thoughts were dangerous, could get you reported to the commissariat or worse, to the Inquisition if they happened to be present. Even thinking them was a kind of treason. But I couldn't stop. The angels weren't human anymore. Or they were more than human, or less. The distinctions blurred and multiplied the more I thought about them. They'd been made into living weapons through a process so traumatic it killed most candidates. Their minds had been conditioned to remove doubt, fear, hesitation, all the things that made humans human. Their bodies had been rebuilt with extra organs that let them spit acid and breathe poison and function in environments that would kill normal humans in seconds. They'd been given centuries of life in exchange for absolute servitude to a war that would never end. And yet they still breathed. That was the thing I couldn't get past. Underneath all the transformation and conditioning and augmentation, they still needed to breathe, still needed that fundamental biological process that connected them to every other human being in the Imperium. They could survive wounds that would kill anyone else, could fight for days without rest, could process toxins that would liquefy normal organs, but they still needed air. It made them vulnerable, and it made them human. I must have stood there for an hour or more, lost in thought, before exhaustion finally drove me to my bunk. I lay in the narrow cot, surrounded by the sounds of other servitor technicians sleeping or trying to sleep, and stared at the underside of the bunk above me. Someone had scratched a prayer to the Emperor into the metal, the letters crude but deeply etched. I traced them with my eyes, following the familiar words, finding no comfort in them. The Emperor protects, the prayer said. But who protected us from the Emperor? From the Imperium he'd created, from the machinery that ground up human lives and spat them out as statistics. The angels were proof that it could work, that you could take a human and remake them so completely that they became something else. But they were also proof of the cost, of what had to be sacrificed for that transformation. I thought about the one in the corridor again, dying alone in the dark. Would anyone come for him? Would his battle brothers retrieve his gene seed, that precious biological treasure that allowed the chapter to create new angels? Or would he be left there, another piece of debris to be catalogued and disposed of by the reclamation crews? Did the angels mourn their dead, or was even grief conditioned out of them, replaced with cold assessment of tactical losses? Sleep came eventually, but it was shallow and filled with dreams. In them I heard breathing, that soft mechanical hiss overlaying organic function, coming from everywhere and nowhere. I saw corridors filled with pale giants who moved with terrible grace, each one waiting patiently to die, each one still drawing breath despite everything. When the klaxons woke me for the next shift, I felt more tired than when I'd lain down, but I rose anyway, dressed in my stained work coveralls, checked my rebreather, and reported to the ammunition bay. The hoists needed maintenance. The shells needed to move. The war continued regardless of how any individual felt about it. That was the first day. The day I heard an angel breathe and began to understand what we were all part of, what vast machinery we existed within. I didn't know then that it was only the beginning, that the sound would haunt me through everything that came after, that it would become the measure by which I judged my own humanity or lack thereof. But I knew something had changed. Some seal had been broken, some protection stripped away. I'd seen behind the propaganda, glimpsed the truth that lay beneath the comfortable lies we told ourselves about duty and honor and the Emperor's will. The angels were human once, and somewhere, buried beneath the conditioning and the augmentation and the centuries of war, they still were. They still breathed, still needed that fundamental connection to the biological processes that defined mortal existence. It should have been comforting. Instead, it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever learned. The second time I heard it, the sound had multiplied. It was during an engagement on the southern wall, 3 weeks after my first encounter with the Angels. The xenoforms had adapted their tactics, stopped throwing themselves mindlessly at our guns, and instead began using the tunnel systems beneath the firebase, emerging in unexpected places, forcing us to defend multiple fronts simultaneously. The ammunition requirements had doubled, then tripled, and we worked around the clock to keep the hoists operational and the shells moving. I'd been assigned to an emergency detail, helping to establish a new firing position in sub-level beta after the xenoforms breached the original southern defensive line. We were dragging stubber emplacements and ammunition crates through corridors that still smelled of promethium and burnt flesh, past walls marked with scorch patterns and impact craters. The detail consisted of 15 servitor technicians, 3 PDF troopers as security, and an overseer who'd already sent 2 people back with injuries from equipment accidents. That's when the Angels came. There were 5 of them, moving through the corridor in a formation that seemed both casual and precisely calculated. They flowed around obstacles, their massive forms somehow fitting through spaces that looked too small, their weapons held in positions that suggested they could engage targets in any direction within milliseconds. And I heard it, all 5 of them breathing in a rhythm that was almost synchronized, but not quite, creating a pattern that was hypnotic and disturbing. The detail froze. You didn't continue working when the Angels passed. You stopped. You stepped aside. You made yourself small and hoped they didn't notice you. The PDF troopers snapped to attention, their lasguns held across their chests. The overseer made a gesture that might have been a benediction or just an attempt to appear respectful, and I stood there with my hands still gripping the stubber's mounting bracket, listening to 5 Angels breathe. They were speaking to each other, I realized, not in Gothic or any language I recognized, but in some kind of battle cant, clipped syllables and sharp consonants that conveyed tactical information with brutal efficiency. One of them, the one at the front, his armor bearing more honor markings than the others, gestured toward a junction ahead of us, and the formation shifted instantly, 3 breaking off to take up covering positions while 2 moved forward to scout, and through it all, that sound, that breathing. 5 sets of lungs expanding and contracting, 5 rebreather systems processing air, 5 biological organisms maintaining the fundamental functions of life, while simultaneously being so far beyond normal human limitations that they seemed like different species entirely. The lead Angel stopped next to our detail. He was so close I could have reached out and touched his armor, could see the scratches and dents that marked where enemy weapons had struck and failed to penetrate. His helmet turned toward us, the red lenses sweeping across our faces, assessing and categorizing. Then he spoke, and his voice came out as a deep rumble that I felt in my chest as much as heard. Ammunition status. The overseer stepped forward, data slate trembling in his hands. 300 rounds of heavy stubber, 7 to 5 mm, 200 rounds for the auto cannons, 20 mm high explosive, 15 kilograms of plastic explosives, standard pattern, all being moved to the new southern position as ordered. The Angel said nothing for a moment, processing the information. Then, insufficient. Double the explosive allocation. Prioritize anti-armor munitions. The enemy is adapting. Yes, my lord, the overseer said, his voice cracking slightly. At once, the Angel turned away, dismissing us from his attention, and moved to rejoin his squad. Within seconds they disappeared into the darkness ahead, their breathing fading but never quite vanishing, leaving an echo that seemed to hang in the air long after they were gone. We stood there in silence for a full minute. No one wanted to be the first to move, to break the spell, to acknowledge what had just happened. Finally, the overseer cleared his throat and began giving orders, sending 2 technicians back to requisition more explosives, adjusting the loads on the remaining carts. I went through the motions automatically, my hands performing familiar tasks while my mind churned. The Angel had said the enemy was adapting. That meant the xenoforms were learning, changing their tactics in response to our defenses. It meant the siege could go on longer, could get worse. It meant more death, more casualties, more corridors to clear, and bodies to recover. It also meant the angels were concerned. That single phrase, "the enemy is adapting," contained within it an acknowledgement that this wasn't a simple cleanup operation, that even with their presence the outcome wasn't certain. If the angels could be concerned, could recognize genuine threat, then we were in more danger than the official reports admitted. We completed the equipment transfer and returned to our regular duties. I found myself back in the ammunition bay, performing routine maintenance while the guns above thundered their endless rhythm. But I couldn't stop thinking about those 5 angels, couldn't stop hearing their breathing overlapped and interweaved, couldn't stop wondering what it meant that they needed to coordinate, to work as a unit, to employ tactics at all. In the propaganda reels, angels fought alone, each one worth 100 guardsmen, unstoppable engines of destruction that needed no support and acknowledged no limitation. But these angels had moved as a squad, had taken up covering positions, had expressed concern about ammunition and enemy adaptation. They were soldiers, highly trained, and almost impossible to kill, but still soldiers operating within the constraints of military reality, still human enough to need tactics, still human enough to breathe. I thought about my own breathing then, became suddenly conscious of the rise and fall of my chest, the way air moved through my lungs, the automatic process that my body performed without conscious thought. How much of me was still human in any meaningful sense? I worked when told to work, slept when time was allotted, ate the nutrient paste without tasting it, performed maintenance rituals on machines whose purposes I only dimly understood. I was a component in a larger system, as much a tool as the hoists I serviced. But I still breathed, and I still thought, even though my thoughts were dangerous, even though they led nowhere useful. I still experienced the world through senses that registered cold and heat and pain and fear. I still dreamed, though my dreams were increasingly filled with the sounds of war and the sight of angels dying in the dark. The weeks ground on. The siege intensified. The xenoforms came in greater numbers, using new tactics, employing biological horrors we'd never seen before. Creatures that could squeeze through gaps narrower than a human torso, that could scale walls with clawed appendages, that secreted acids capable of eating through plasteel. We adapted to, or tried to, installing new defenses and reinforcing weak points and burning anything that moved in the killing zones beyond our walls. And the angels fought. I saw them more often now, passing through the lower levels as they moved between engagements, always in small squads, always speaking in that clipped battle cant. I learned to recognize individuals by the damage to their armor, by the particular markings they bore. The one with the broken pauldron who'd been dying in the corridor survived. I saw him 3 times more, each time moving with the same lethal grace despite injuries that should have been crippling. Each time I heard them breathe, it became a fixation, an obsession I couldn't shake. I found myself stopping mid-task to listen, to distinguish the mechanical hiss of rebreathers from the organic expansion of lungs beneath. I started noticing the breathing of everyone around me, the rapid, shallow breaths of frightened PDF troopers, the steady rhythm of experienced workers, the labored gasps of the injured. The entire firebase seemed to breathe as one organism, drawing in air and pushing it out, maintaining life through sheer stubborn persistence. I wondered if the angels noticed it too, if their enhanced hearing picked up the collective respiration of 5,000 human souls crammed into a fortress that was slowly being overrun, if they could hear the fear in people's breathing, the exhaustion, the despair, if it meant anything to them, or if they'd been conditioned to ignore such signals, to focus only on tactical data and threat assessment. During my 4th assigned reclamation detail, I found another angel, or rather, I found what remained of one. We'd been sent to clear Section 9 of the Western Defensive Line, where a xenoform breakthrough had been repelled after 6 hours of close-quarters fighting. The section was a maze of intersecting corridors and small rooms that had once been storage areas, now transformed into a labyrinth of death. Bodies lay everywhere, stacked in corners where fighting had been fiercest. scattered singly where people had fallen during the retreat or pursuit. I was working through a particularly dense cluster of casualties when I saw the armor. Pale ceramite, dark crimson trim, the distinctive shape of Astartes' warplate. It was in pieces, scattered across 3 meters of corridor, torn apart by forces I couldn't imagine. And among the armor pieces, there was flesh. Not much. The angels' bodies were resilient, capable of surviving tremendous damage. But whatever had killed this one had been thorough. I found what might have been a hand, the fingers curled into a fist, augmented bones visible where flesh had been torn away, a section of ribcage, the extra organs that made an angel more than human exposed to the air, something that had been part of a face, one amber eye still intact and staring sightlessly at the ceiling. I stood there staring at the pieces, my collection bag forgotten. This had been an angel, a posthuman warrior, a living weapon, something that was supposed to be nearly indestructible, and it had been ripped apart like the rest of us, reduced to scattered components that would need to be catalogued and processed. The detail leader found me there, grabbed my shoulder and shook me. "Keep moving," she said, her voice sharp. "There's nothing you can do for him." "Shouldn't we?" I started, then stopped. "Shouldn't we what? Recover the body? Treat it with special reverence? Alert the other angels that one of their own had fallen? His brothers will come for the gene seed," she said, reading my thoughts. "That's all that matters. Now move." I moved. But I kept glancing back at the scattered remains, kept thinking about the fact that somewhere in that mess of torn flesh and broken armor had been a person, someone who'd been selected as a child, transformed through unimaginable suffering, conditioned to be a perfect weapon, and then killed anyway. Someone who'd breathed and bled and died despite everything the Imperium had done to make them immortal. We finished the detail and returned to base. I went through my rest cycle, reported for my next shift, maintained the hoists, moved ammunition, kept the machinery running. But something had broken inside me. Some final barrier between acceptance and understanding. The angels were human. Not human like I was human, not human in any normal sense, but human nonetheless. They'd been made into something else, but they couldn't escape their fundamental nature. They still needed to breathe. They still needed to eat and drink and sleep, even if they needed less than normal humans. They still died when sufficiently damaged, their enhanced biology failing just like everyone else's when pushed past certain limits. And if the angels could die, could fail, could be broken down into scattered pieces of meat and metal, then the Imperium itself could fail. The great machine could stop, could seize up, could grind to a halt, despite all the prayers and rituals and sacrifices. We were all components in a system that was fundamentally fragile, kept running only through constant maintenance and the willingness to replace any part that wore out. I thought about reporting myself then, going to the commissariat and confessing these heretical thoughts, accepting whatever judgment they deemed appropriate. At least it would end the questioning, the constant circling around truths I didn't want to acknowledge. At least I wouldn't have to carry this burden anymore. But I didn't. Some part of me, the part that still breathed, still maintained basic human functions despite everything, wanted to survive, wanted to see what came next, even if what came next was just more of the same grinding horror. The human instinct for survival ran deeper than logic or faith or despair. So I kept working, kept maintaining the hoists, kept listening to the angels breathe. The turning point came during the 3rd month of the siege, when the xenoforms breached sub-level Delta. I was off shift, resting in my bunk, when the alarms changed their pattern. Not the usual 3 short 2 long that meant contact on the perimeter, but a continuous wailing that meant internal breach. I rolled out of the cot already, reaching for my rebreather, muscle memory taking over before conscious thought. Around me, other technicians were doing the same, moving with the practiced speed of people who'd drilled this scenario countless times. We assembled in the corridor outside the barracks, 30 workers in various states of readiness, all looking to the detail leader for orders. She emerged from her office carrying a combat shotgun, her augmetic eye spinning as it processed information from the firebase's central command. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but I could hear the undercurrent of fear. Xenoforms in the eastern storage sections. All non-combat personnel are to evacuate to sub-level Epsilon. Combat-rated personnel will assist with establishing defensive positions. She paused, her real eye sweeping across us. Move quickly. Stay together. Emperor protects. Emperor protects. We echoed, the response automatic, even now. We moved in a group, following the designated evacuation routes that we'd practiced but never actually used. The corridors were chaos. People streaming in multiple directions, some toward the breach to reinforce the defenders, others away toward presumably safer sections. Somewhere above us, the guns had gone silent, their crews either dead or fighting hand-to-hand against the xenoforms that had gotten inside our perimeter. I was near the back of our group, helping an older technician who'd injured his leg in some previous accident and couldn't move quickly. We'd just turned into the main transit corridor when I heard it. Breathing. Multiple sources. Close. The angels came from a side passage, 7 of them moving at combat speed, their weapons ready, their armor splashed with alien ichor that steamed in the recycled air. They swept past us without slowing, oriented on the breach, moving with such speed and purpose that they seemed like a force of nature rather than individuals. And in their wake came that sound, that overlapping pattern of mechanical and organic breathing that had haunted me for weeks. One of them was the angel from the corridor, the one I'd seen wounded. His armor was still damaged, the crack in his breastplate sealed but visible, but he moved with the same lethal grace as the others, surviving what should have killed him, fighting on because that's what he'd been made to do, unable to stop even if he wanted to because the conditioning ran too deep. They vanished into the chaos ahead, toward the sound of gunfire and screaming, and I realized something that made me go cold despite the stifling heat of the lower levels. They were afraid. Not in any way I could articulate or prove, not in any sense that would register on their facial expressions or their movements, but I could hear it in their breathing, in the way the pattern wasn't quite synchronized, in the slight increase in respiration rate that suggested their enhanced physiology was preparing for extreme exertion. The angels were afraid, and that meant we should all be terrified. The older technician pulled at my arm. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice tight with pain and fear. I nodded and helped him forward, forcing my legs to move, forcing myself to follow the evacuation route, even though every instinct was screaming at me to find a hole and hide. We made it to sub-level Epsilon and joined the mass of personnel who'd already evacuated. Hundreds of people crammed into spaces designed for maybe half that number. The air was thick with body heat and fierce sweat, the Vox system crackling with contradictory reports and orders. We waited. Minutes stretched into hours. The sounds of fighting filtered down from above gunfire, explosions, the distinctive crack of bolter rounds, and underneath it all the wet sounds of close-quarters combat. I found myself counting breaths, my own and those of the people around me, trying to calculate how long the recyclers could maintain the air supply with this many people in such a confined space. 12 hours. That's how long we waited in sub-level Epsilon before the all-clear sounded and we were allowed to return to our stations. 12 hours of not knowing, of listening to the battle overhead, of wondering if the next sound we heard would be xenoforms breaking through the final barriers. When we finally emerged, the firebase was transformed. Bodies lay in the corridors, some human, some alien. Blood and ichor mixed in pools that spread across the deck plating. Entire sections had been sealed off after the atmosphere was compromised, the blast doors welded shut with the dead still inside. We'd held, but barely, and the cost was written in burned flesh and shattered equipment. I was assigned to reclamation detail immediately. No rest period, no time to process what had happened. We worked for 3 days straight, clearing the dead, recovering equipment, documenting losses. The numbers were staggering. 800 personnel casualties, 3 entire gun sections destroyed, 40% of our stored ammunition expended, 5 angels wounded severely enough to require extended recuperation. 5. Out of 12, almost half their effective strength. I saw them again during the second day of cleanup, being escorted to a section of the firebase that had been converted into some kind of Medicae facility. They moved under their own power but slowly, each step careful and measured. One was missing an arm, the stump sealed with emergency cauterization. Another had taken damage to his leg, the armor there crumpled, and the limb beneath clearly broken despite the enhanced bone structure. The third had a head wound, his helmet missing and the side of his skull, showing augmetic replacement where flesh should have been. And they were all breathing. Labored, painful breathing that reminded me viscerally that underneath the armor and the enhancements they were still biological organisms, still subject to the same basic requirements as the rest of us. They could be hurt, they could bleed, they could die. I watched them pass and felt something shift in my understanding. The angels weren't invincible. They were just harder to kill, required more damage to stop, could keep fighting through injuries that would fell anyone else. But the fundamental equation was the same: apply enough force and anything breaks. The Imperium knew this, of course. That's why there were procedures for recovering gene seed, for salvaging the biological treasures that could create new angels from the bodies of the fallen. That's why they sent these 12 here instead of 100. Because they were valuable and needed elsewhere. Because even with their capabilities they were a finite resource that had to be allocated carefully. We were all finite resources, all consumable, all ultimately destined to be used up and replaced. I continued working, my hands moving through familiar motions, my mind elsewhere. The corridors were endless, the bodies countless, the task of cleanup stretching ahead with no clear endpoint. I stopped counting the dead after the first 100, stopped reading the names on the dog tags, stopped treating them as individuals, and started thinking of them as debris to be cleared, obstacles between the current state and the desired state of restored functionality. I was becoming what the Imperium wanted me to be: a tool, a component, a thing that performed its function without question or hesitation, and I was doing it to survive, to maintain the psychological distance necessary to keep working without breaking down. But I still heard the breathing. Mine, theirs, everyone's. That fundamental sound that connected us all, that proved we were alive despite everything, that we were still human even as we lost our humanity piece by piece. During the 4th day of cleanup, I found myself in the section where the angels had been wounded. The fighting here had been apocalyptic, the walls scored by bolter fire and acid sprays, the floor buckled in places where heavy impacts had occurred. I was searching for salvageable equipment when I found it. A helmet. Angel pattern. Damaged but recognizable. The red lenses were cracked, the Vox grill bent, but the rebreather system was still intact. I picked it up, felt the weight of it, looked at my reflection in the curved surface of the faceplate, and I put it on. It was too large, of course, designed for a skull that had been surgically modified and enhanced, but I could feel the seals engage, could hear the rebreather system activate, could feel air being processed and fed to me through mechanisms designed for a posthuman warrior. The helmet's auto senses flickered to life, providing tactical information overlays and threat assessments, trying to interface with augmetic systems I didn't have. But underneath all the technology, I could hear it. My own breathing, amplified and mechanical, transformed by the helmet's systems into something that sounded like an angel's breath. That same overlapping pattern of organic and mechanical, the sound that had haunted me for months. I wore it for maybe 30 seconds before taking it off, my hands shaking. Wearing it felt wrong, blasphemous, like I'd violated something sacred. But in those 30 seconds I'd understood something new, something terrifying. The angels breathed like that all the time. Every moment they wore their armor, they heard that sound, experienced that mechanical mediation of a basic biological function. They lived inside those suits, fought in them, probably even slept in them. Their entire sensory experience of the world was filtered through the armor's systems, translated and interpreted and fed to them in forms optimized for combat effectiveness. How much of them was still the boy who'd been selected? How much remained of the original person after decades or centuries of living inside that armored shell, after endless conditioning and combat, after being transformed so thoroughly that basic human connection became impossible? I thought about the one I'd seen dying in the corridor, sitting against the wall with his helmet off, his face exposed. Had he removed it seeking some last moment of unmediated experience, some final connection to what he'd been before the transformation? Or had it simply been damaged beyond function, leaving him no choice? I placed the helmet carefully back where I'd found it and continued working. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop hearing the sound of my own breathing, amplified and transformed, couldn't stop wondering if the angels experienced something similar, a kind of permanent dissociation between their biological selves and the mechanical extensions that had become inseparable from their identity. The siege continued. We repaired what could be repaired, replaced what couldn't, adapted to the new normal of living under constant threat. The angels returned to active duty as soon as their wounds healed, or before they healed, fighting with injuries that would have permanently disabled anyone else. I saw them regularly now, moving through the lower levels, always in squads, always breathing that distinctive pattern that I could pick out even over the ambient noise of the firebase. I started dreaming about breathing. Dreams where I couldn't draw air, where my lungs seized and failed, where the atmosphere turned to poison and everyone around me suffocated slowly. Dreams where I was wearing angel armor and couldn't remove it, trapped inside the mechanical shell, my body enhanced and transformed, but my mind still fully human and aware of everything that had been taken from me. I woke from these dreams gasping, my hands clutching at my throat, my heart racing, and then I'd lie there in the dark, listening to the breathing of the other servitor technicians around me, finding a strange comfort in the collective sound of respiration, proof that we were all still alive, still human, still maintaining that most basic biological function despite everything. 5 months into the siege, the pattern changed again. The xenoforms had been quiet for 3 days, no attacks on the perimeter, no probes of our defenses. The guns fell silent. In the unexpected quiet we could hear the firebase itself, the hum of generators, the clank of the hoists, the whisper of the recyclers processing air, and underneath it all, breathing. The angels called a meeting of senior personnel in the command chamber of Level Alpha. I shouldn't have been there. I was nobody, a servitor technician 3rd class with no authority and no strategic value. But someone must have made an error on the attendance list, or perhaps they simply summoned everyone who could be spared from essential duties, because I found myself standing in the back of the chamber with 200 others, while an angel explained what was about to happen. He stood at the front of the chamber, unhelmeted, his face composed in an expression that might have been calm or might have been the absence of normal emotional effect. His voice carried clearly despite not being amplified, each word chosen with precision. The xenoform hive structure is preparing a final assault, he said. Intelligence indicates they have been consolidating forces in the tunnel systems, gathering all remaining bioforms for a single coordinated attack on our position. We estimate their numbers at 50,000, possibly more. Silence. The kind of silence that comes when people hear their death sentence pronounced with mechanical precision. The angel continued. All defensive positions will be reinforced. Ammunition will be redistributed to priority emplacements. Non-combat personnel will be evacuated to the deepest levels and sealed in if necessary. He paused, his amber eyes sweeping across the assembled personnel. This firebase has strategic value. We will hold it. That was all. No stirring speeches about duty or honor, no invocations of the Emperor's protection, no acknowledgement that he was essentially telling us we were all going to die, just a statement of fact and expectation. We were dismissed. I filed out with the others, my mind struggling to process what I'd heard. 50,000 xenoforms, against maybe 4,000 remaining defenders and 12 angels. The mathematics were clear and brutal. I went to the ammunition bay, started performing emergency maintenance on all the hoists, knowing that they'd need to function perfectly during the coming battle. Around me, others were doing the same, checking equipment, running diagnostics, reciting prayers to machine spirits with a fervor born of desperation. If the hoists failed, if the ammunition stopped moving, the guns would fall silent and we'd all die. So we worked. We maintained. We kept the machinery running because that's what we'd been trained to do, because it was the only way we knew to fight back against the universe's indifference. The angels were everywhere in those final hours before the assault. I saw them moving through the levels, checking defensive positions, speaking with gun crew chiefs, their presence somehow both reassuring and terrifying. They moved with the same controlled grace they always had, but I could hear it now, in their breathing, the change in rhythm that suggested anticipation, preparation, the biological systems gearing up for extreme exertion. They knew we were going to die. All of us. The fortress might hold, but the cost would be total. Everyone currently inside these walls would be expended in its defense, and they accepted this with the same mechanical precision they applied to everything else, because that's what they'd been made to do. I found myself in the southern defensive line as the assault began, pressed into service as an ammunition runner when casualties depleted the regular staff. The xenoforms came in a wave that seemed to have no end, pouring from the tunnels in numbers that defied comprehension. They absorbed our fire, climbed over their own dead, kept coming with mindless determination. And the angels fought. I saw them moving through the defensive positions, wherever the pressure was greatest, wherever the lines threatened to break. Their bolt guns spoke with mechanical rhythm, each shot precisely placed, each target selected for maximum strategic impact. They moved with a grace that seemed impossible given their bulk, flowing through obstacles, repositioning constantly to maintain optimal firing angles. But I also saw them wounded. Saw one go down when a xenoform breached his defense and tore at his armor with claws designed to penetrate ceramite. Saw him stand again, missing half his faceplate, one eye gone, and keep fighting. Saw another lose his weapon and switch to his combat blade, carving through enemies with movements too fast to track. Saw a third's armor breach completely, alien acid eating through the seals, and watched him continue fighting even as his own blood steamed in contact with the toxin. And through it all, that sound, that breathing, labored now, ragged, the mechanical systems struggling to keep up with the demands being placed on enhanced, but still biological bodies. They were running on reserves, pushing past limits that would kill normal humans, and still they fought. I ran ammunition until my legs gave out, crawled when I couldn't run, dragged crates of shells through corridors slick with blood and ichor until my hands were raw. Around me, people died in groups and singly, torn apart or burned or simply crushed under the weight of the enemy's numbers. The defensive line bent, threatened to break, held through sheer stubborn refusal to do otherwise. And then, after hours that felt like years, the assault ended. Not defeated, but withdrawn, the xenoforms pulling back to their tunnels as abruptly as they'd emerged. We stood in the aftermath, surrounded by bodies that were stacked 3 deep in places, and tried to understand that we'd survived. The casualty reports came in over the next hours. 70% losses, most of the gun crews dead or too wounded to continue, entire sections of the fortress compromised and sealed, and the Angels 9 remained standing. 3 dead, their gene seed recovered, their bodies to be given whatever honors their chapter prescribed. I helped with the cleanup again. This time, there was no organization, no orderly process. We simply tried to clear enough space to function, to create paths through the dead, to restore some minimal level of operational capacity. I worked until I collapsed, was dragged to a medical station, given stimulants and fluids, and sent back to work. During the 3rd day of post-battle operations, I found myself in a section that had been breached and sealed. The atmosphere had been compromised, requiring full hazard suits for entry. I was searching for salvageable equipment when I heard it. Breathing. Faint but distinctive. The mechanical organic pattern I'd learned to recognize. I followed the sound to a collapsed section of wall. Someone was trapped underneath, alive but immobilized. I called for help, got 3 others to assist, and we began the careful process of moving debris without causing further collapse. It took an hour to free him. One of the angels, his armor so damaged I couldn't tell which one he was, both legs crushed beneath fallen rockcrete, his rebreather system failing. We got him clear, and I looked at his face, young and old simultaneously, twisted with pain that his conditioning couldn't fully suppress. He looked at me, his amber eyes focusing with difficulty, and spoke. His voice was weak, distorted by damage to the Vox system, but I heard the words clearly. Leave me. Recover the gene seed. Continue the mission. Standard doctrine. An angel's last duty was to ensure the chapter's genetic legacy was preserved. His life mattered only in terms of what could be salvaged from his death, but I couldn't do it. Couldn't just walk away and let him die in the dark. Couldn't reduce him to a collection of salvageable organs. So I stayed. I sat beside him in that collapsed section while my suit's air supply slowly depleted, and I listened to him breathe. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. He was dying and we both knew it, his enhanced physiology finally overwhelmed by the catastrophic damage. But his lungs kept working, drawing air through the damaged rebreather, maintaining that fundamental biological function until the very end. I watched his chest rise and fall, the rhythm growing slower, more irregular. Watched the light in his eyes dim gradually, consciousness fading as his body's systems began to fail. And I listened to him breathe, that sound that had haunted me for months, that had become the measure of humanity in a place where humanity was systematically destroyed. He died while I was sitting there. One breath, then another, each one weaker than the last, until finally there was silence. His chest stopped moving. The rebreather's mechanical hiss continued for a few more seconds, processing air that no longer reached living lungs. Then it too fell silent. I sat there with the body for a while longer, until my suit's air supply alarm began to sound. Then I stood, marked the location for the gene seed recovery teams, and made my way back to functional sections of the firebase. I should have felt something. Relief that he'd found peace, or grief at the loss, or satisfaction at having done a kindness for a dying warrior. But I felt nothing, just emptiness, and a profound exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. I was becoming them, I realized. Becoming like the angels, like all the others who'd survived long enough to have the emotions systematically ground out of them by the endless horror. I was losing my humanity, not through transformation or conditioning, but through simple attrition. The weight of accumulated trauma crushing the parts of me that could still feel. But I still breathed. That fundamental biological function continued despite everything, my lungs expanding and contracting, drawing in the recycled air and pushing it out, maintaining life through mechanical necessity. The siege ended 3 weeks later, not because we won, but because the enemy withdrew, their hive structure, apparently deciding that this particular fortress wasn't worth the continued expenditure of resources. We stood down from combat positions, began the long process of assessing damage and planning repairs, sent out requests for reinforcements and supplies that would probably take months to arrive if they came at all. Of the 12 angels who'd come to our world, 6 remained. Half their effective strength lost defending a fortress that was strategically useful but not critical, expended in a siege that would be recorded as a minor footnote in the endless war. They would leave soon, redeployed to wherever the chapter needed them next, to do it all again on some other world, against some other enemy, and we would remain. Those of us who'd survived would stay here, maintaining the fortress, waiting for the next attack, slowly being worn down until we too became casualties or were transferred elsewhere to continue the cycle. We'd breathe the recycled air and eat the nutrient paste and maintain the machinery until we couldn't anymore. And then we'd be replaced by others who would do the same. I requested a transfer to permanent reclamation detail. It was granted immediately. People didn't volunteer for that work, so anyone who did was accepted without question. I spent my days moving through the aftermath, clearing bodies, recovering equipment, documenting the dead for administratum records that no one would ever read. and I listened. To the sound of my own breathing, amplified in the silence of cleared corridors, to the breathing of the work crews, each person maintaining that fundamental rhythm, to the memory of Angel's breathing, that mechanical organic pattern that had shown me the truth underneath the propaganda. We were all the same, enhanced or baseline, conditioned or untrained, angel or servitor technician, we all needed to breathe. We all existed within biological constraints that could be pushed but never truly escaped. We all died when sufficiently damaged, our enhanced or unenhanced bodies failing in the same fundamental way. The Imperium had taken children and made them into weapons, had transformed humans into instruments of its will, had created these perfect soldiers who could fight for centuries and survive injuries that would kill anyone else. But it couldn't make them immortal. It couldn't remove the fundamental vulnerability that came with being alive. They still needed to breathe, and that meant they could still die. I think about this now, in what I know are my final moments. The reclamation detail was sent to clear Section 12 of the Western Defensive Line, where reports indicated there might be salvageable equipment. What they didn't mention was that the xenoforms had left something behind, something that waited in the dark until we were deep enough inside, until there was no escape. I'm lying against a wall now, much like that angel I saw months ago, breathing slowly and carefully, while my body tries to cope with damage that's beyond its capacity to repair. The others from my detail are dead, torn apart in the first seconds of the attack. I survived only because I fell into a collapsed section, and the xenoform couldn't reach me. Lost interest, moved on to find other prey. My rebreather is failing. I can hear it struggling, the filters clogged with something, dust or blood or worse. Each breath takes conscious effort now, my lungs working against resistance that increases with every cycle. I know how this ends. The rebreather will fail completely, or I'll lose consciousness from blood loss, or something will find me here and finish what the first xenoform started. But I'm still breathing, still maintaining that fundamental biological function, still drawing air and pushing it out, still alive in the most basic sense, even though I'm dying. And in this moment, I understand what the angels understood, what everyone who served and died in this endless war understands eventually. This is all we have. This breathing, this continuation of biological processes, this stubborn refusal of our bodies to stop until forced to stop. The Imperium gives us purpose and duty and the promise of meaning in service. But underneath all that, there's just this: the automatic rise and fall of lungs, the beating of hearts, the maintenance of life for its own sake. The angels were human. I know that now with certainty. Not human in the way I'm human, but human nonetheless, connected to all of us through shared biological necessity. They breathed and bled and died like we did, just slower, just harder to kill, just better at surviving the unsurvivable. But the fundamental equation was the same, and when they died, when they finally took that last breath and fell silent, they experienced the same thing I'm experiencing now. This gradual dimming, this slow failure of systems, this final surrender to the universe's indifference. They just had more systems to fail, more augmentations to break down, more enhanced organs to stop functioning. But eventually, they all stopped breathing. I can hear my own breathing now, ragged and wet, the sound echoing in my damaged rebreather. It sounds different than the angel's breathing, less mechanical, more biological, but it follows the same basic pattern: in and out, rise and fall, the rhythm of life maintained until it can't be maintained any longer. I wonder if they'll find me, if a reclamation detail will eventually clear this section and add my name to their lists, recover my dog tags for the administratum records, note my death in whatever bland language they use to describe casualties, or if I'll simply be sealed in when they close off this section, left here with the other dead, one more piece of debris that isn't worth the effort to clear. It doesn't matter. Either way, I'll stop breathing soon. The pattern will end, the rhythm will cease, and I'll become another statistic in a war that has no end, Another small and fragile thing extinguished by a galaxy that specializes in extinguishing small and fragile things. But I heard them breathe. That matters somehow, though I can't articulate why. I heard the angels breathe and understood what they were, what we all are. Biological organisms trying to survive in a universe that doesn't care. Maintaining life through simple mechanical necessity. Continuing until we can't continue any longer. My vision is dimming now. The rebreather's failing completely, I think, or maybe it's blood loss, or maybe just my body finally giving up. The breathing is harder with each cycle, my lungs struggling against damage I can't see and can't fix. I should be afraid, should be crying out for help that won't come, struggling against the inevitable, but I'm not. I'm calm, almost peaceful, because I understand now. This is what the angels felt. Sitting wounded in the dark, waiting for death or recovery or orders. This strange tranquility that comes from accepting the inevitable, from releasing the struggle, and just letting your body continue its automatic processes until they stop. In and out, rise and fall. The breath moves through me, slower now, weaker, but still maintaining that fundamental rhythm, still proving that I'm alive, still connecting me to every other living thing in this firebase, on this world, across the Imperium. We're all breathing together, all maintaining that simple biological function, all alive until we're not. I think I hear something. Footsteps, maybe, or just my mind creating sound to fill the silence. It doesn't matter. My breathing is so shallow now, barely moving air, my chest barely rising. The rhythm is breaking down, becoming irregular, skipping beats. One more breath, in and out, and another, weaker still, and another. And